So, given all this talk of progress, however, I think it's important that we don't fall into yet another trap, and that's the idea of what we might call the liberal myth of seamless progress. And this is the idea that we're moving slowly and gradually towards a more enlightened multicultural future. And this idea itself, perversely and appropriately enough, can be traced back to the same moment in which racialisation itself was solidified and constructed as a project, the Enlightenment. For a crucial and formative aspect of the Enlightenment was the idea that we're progressing slowly but surely into a better world. And such narratives, I think, can still be seen to structure many aspects of contemporary culture, including discourses of heritage and race. And they're very tempting, in their overwhelming optimism. And I think, it's important at the same time not to underplay to what extent we need optimism to effect any kind of change. A healthy dose of optimism is important in making anything happen. But at the same time, we need to be aware of what such ideas that we're progressing slowly, seamlessly into a future that's just going to be better and more multicultural, what that can miss out. Because what it seems to miss out to me is the idea that history invariably teaches us that progressive change isn't just a seamless saunter into the sunset. It's not automatic, it's not inevitable. There are lots of problems along the way, and the way might turn a different way than you expect. And to say this, I think, isn't to say that nothing changes or what goes around comes around, but rather it's to point out that heritage and race and the relationship between them is very multifaceted, and it's not guaranteed, and it's shaped by a variety of contexts. And what the liberal narrative does, the liberal narrative of seamless progress, it tends to obscure these processes of complexity, and in turn the types of understanding that you need to try and mobilise towards more far-reaching forms of change. And there's a very interesting writer called Viv Sekeres who's written about Australian museums in particular, and she writes about how the process of reconciliation between Aboriginal and white people in Australian museums in the 80s, and she talks about how it was going really well. Everything was progressing quite interestingly until there was a rise in Australia of the right-wing government, and in particular Pauline Hanson's One Nation party. And they basically campaigned on a platform of anti-immigration. And what happened was basically all the curators that were working towards reconciliation suddenly became accused of peddling what was called a black armband history. They got told that they were being politically correct. And suddenly the climate shifted. And they got told that this was, it was too trendy, it wasn't really addressing the problems. And the climate shifted against them. And so as Viv Sekeres talks about, suddenly it became really problematic to mention the fact that there had been massacres against Aborigines. It became vilified, and it kind of dropped off the agenda. So the liberal myth obscures those kind of things. And in terms of the UK, we might think about, again, like the racialisation of citizenship. So we might think about how Gary Young has argued that the types of citizenship tests that have been introduced mean that we are returning, as Gary Young puts it, to the crude and flawed mythology of a monoracial, culturally uniform British identity in which non-white people's presence is tolerated, and then only conditionally. So he's writing in 2002 when the citizenship tests have been introduced. And he says that 3 years ago it was racism that was regarded as the problem, and now, once again, it's Britain's ethnic minorities which is becoming the problem. So if we kind of move back from the liberal myth, I think that's quite useful, because then you can see how there are problems here and now that need to be dealt with. And Gary Young is talking about how this is one moment in which Britain is stepping back rather than forward in terms of progress. So the implication of examples like this is that the idea that we're just moving forward to a happier multicultural place is an Enlightenment-derived liberal myth which patronises the past and doesn't do analytical justice to the present. There are clearly some spaces and places in mid-20th century London, for example, such as dance halls, which were more integrated and cosmopolitan than those existing in 2000, such as the BNP-friendly enclave of Barking. We might say then that some aspects of the relationship between heritage and race are moving forward, some are moving back, and some are in flux. But even to say that on its own is pretty banal. to be able to say anything really interesting is probably going to involve thinking about longer-term historical strands or discursive genealogies and very specific cultural, political and social contexts or the contemporary conjuncture at the same time. Okay, so, and fifthly, I think those particular tools are useful for thinking about another problematic strand, and that's corporate multiculturalism, or the phenomenon where diversity is brought together through one particular commonality or the selling of commodities for private profit. Because corporate multiculturalism is quite interesting because it can simultaneously act to popularise or disseminate ideas about multiculturalism, so like Benetton is an arch example there, but it can also act to perpetuate structural inequalities, which are intimately related to inequalities in the past that have been racialised. And as Frans Fanon outlined and predicted, there are numerous correspondences between earlier ages of colonialism and what Hart and Negri term today the contemporary empire of transnational capital, with its globally dispersed pockets of poverty, or what Manuel Castells calls fourth worlds. And Barner-Hess has eloquently written about how any way in which we remember colonialism or slavery today is going to necessarily involve not forgetting how those things connect with the present. So he says that it needs to involve not forgetting how the slavery plantation, for example, how the slavery plantation's complex formative relations of exploitation, exoticism, racism and violence produced the consumerist contours of Western culture, principally through customising the transitional cultural production and consumption of mundane staples of the Western lifestyle, such as coffee, sugar, cotton and tobacco. In other words, the racialised imperialism of the past and the kind of neo-imperialism of the present are very intimately connected, and not bothering to talk about them or trace the connections between them means that we end up with a very impoverished understanding of both. And we might think about this, I think, in terms of how the 2000 celebrations of the abolition of slavery, often talk about very specific examples of slavery that are still being perpetuated, like the trafficking in women, which is obviously really important. But it's notable that what's less conspicuous is how there's less talk about the kind of economic inequalities that still exist because of slavery. And we might think about how it's exhibited in corporate behaviour, so like in Cadbury World again, or through governmental actions, so New Labour's evocation of a multicultural Britain as a kind of resource to generate economic profit, or through popular sentiment, so the idea that you should argue for the free global flow of goods but not people. And to think more positively about examples that address this, I was having a really hard time thinking about examples in Britain, and the only one I could come up with, the ones I could come up with were outside Britain, which is itself quite interesting. But in the States, there's what's a Lower East Side Tenement Museum in New York, and they do really interesting things because they trace the histories of people that lived in the tenements in the Lower East Side, and they kind of link together with union activism now to talk about how people are working in sweatshops, and they try and get people to think about the links between the present and the past in really interesting ways.